Hello, I am Baal Kadmon, and welcome to this podcast. This is a very special podcast because I'm about to announce the creation, not the completion, but the creation of a course called Hebrew for Occultists. Someone asked me a question about a week ago, first of all, they asked, how do I know Hebrew and do I teach it? I know Hebrew because I grew up with several Middle Eastern languages when I was a child, so Hebrew was one of them. The answer to the question is no, I actually don't teach Hebrew, only in certain circumstances if I'm trying to explain a text or a seal or something like that. This sparked an interesting thought in me about Hebrew. But then I sort of relegated it to the side for a moment. I was like, okay, I have a lot going on, so I'll think about it. Then a few days later, a few occultists that are on my Facebook were discussing these various books that have a lot of Hebrew in them. And they expressed that it was rather difficult to really parse through it, even with the translation. They felt that something was missing. And so I coupled that with that question, and I thought, you know what? It would actually be a great idea if I created a course on Hebrew just for occultists. So between the question, these conversations I had with other people, I'm going to do that. And you all know who you are, and you will all hopefully benefit from this. Hebrew is ubiquitous in occult literature and often presents some difficulty to the occultist who may not have knowledge of Hebrew. Since, as I said, I was brought up with several Middle Eastern languages, of which Hebrew was one of them, this was easy for me. All my occult chants and readings that are in Hebrew, I do it in Hebrew because it's just sort of second nature to me. I don't actually read it in the English, but I realize not everyone can do that. And I felt it was really important for me to actually create a course very specific for the occultists. It's certainly not going to teach you how to speak modern day Hebrew, but it really is more specifically to occultists, for occultists. My mission in this world is to teach and help others help themselves. This course will do just that. You will not become fluent, but what you will get from this is at least some basic understanding of Hebrew words within the biblical and occult contexts, plus a lot more. In this podcast, I will give you just a small taste of what will be included in this course. I mean, you'll walk away from this podcast knowing a ton more than you did before. Not necessarily Hebrew, but how nuanced Hebrew is when it comes to biblical and occult teachings. Excuse me. In this course, I'll give you a cursory description of the various Hebrew dialects and scripts, such as Ladino, Yiddish, Yemenite Hebrew, Aramaic, Hebraic Aramaic, and Rashi. I will discuss the problems of Hebrew to English translations. Occult translations, even just plain religious translations of Hebrew to English, is fraught with errors, and in some cases, downright deception. I'll present at least one example here shortly. I will, of course, cover the Hebrew alphabet. I guess you can't really learn Hebrew if you don't know the alphabet. In the course, we will also deconstruct a few Solomonic seals and other seals that are in Hebrew. We will read passages from the Old Testament in its original. We will look at Kabbalistic texts in their original, such as the Zohar, the Bahir, Sefer Yetzirah, Sefer Raziel HaMalach, or the Book of Raziel, or the Book of the Angel Raziel. Obviously, we're not going to read the entire text, but I'm going to show you how to read them. I mean, you'll see me read them, and you'll have a basic understanding. You will also learn that the Hebrew texts themselves have characteristics that lend further explanation to the text, but you'd never know that because the English translation doesn't illustrate it. It actually can't. I will give at least one example of this in this podcast as well. In short, my course will help you read some of the occult writings and biblical passages. You may even walk away with the ability to recite Hebrew prayers as well. As promised, in this podcast, I will give you a small taste. I will illustrate to you why knowing Hebrew as an occultist is very important. My course is a beginner's course, and I really do suggest you learn more on your own. But I want to discuss a few different things. Right now, let's discuss a few different Hebrew dialects and derivatives. Then we will go into certain translational issues that we encounter and some overt mistranslations and purposeful deceptions. You don't want to miss this. Hebrew today is like any other language. It has been standardized. The average Israeli speaks modern Hebrew. Sure, many words found in the Bible are the same, but for the most part, linguistic inflection, word usage, and sentence structures have evolved a bit since biblical times. Hebrew itself has been adapted by the various groups in which it was spoken. Remember, Jews don't only live in Israel. They lived in Europe. They lived in the Middle East. They lived all over the place. And there's even a very prominent Jewish community in China. I think actually it's diminished since, but there is one. For example, Yiddish, a language spoken by European Jews or Ashkenazi Jews. Yiddish is in many ways a hybrid of Hebrew and German and uses Hebrew lettering. And there are, of course, other European languages that influence as well. Take a look at this. It said Yiddische. This is actually in Hebrew letters, but it is in Yiddish. Ladino, a language now used sparingly, is a fusion of Hebrew and Spanish, often called Judeo-Español. This was mainly used by Spanish-speaking Jews. In some instances, it is written with Latin letters like Spanish. In some instances, it is written in Hebraicized font, and other times it is a script called Rashi, which I will describe in a moment. Here is an example of a Ladino in Hebrew script, and that says, Nuevo Silvario de Judeo Español. Okay, and now we move on to Yemenite Hebrew. It's really a system, Yemenite Hebrew is really a system of pronunciation. The letters are pretty much the same, and it's usually spoken by Yemenite Jews, not in a day-to-day, but more in a religious context. It really isn't used in day-to-day conversation, but it is, at least not from the younger generations, but it is still used, like I said, in religious hymns and prayers. I actually posted a video, I don't know, about 3 or 4 weeks ago of Yemenite Hebrew, and many of you liked it, so I might post it again at some other point, and I'll make reference to it once again. One thing that's interesting about Yemenite Hebrew is that scholars say, that it is closest to how Hebrew was spoken in ancient times. One clue to this, to the accuracy of that statement, is that Yemenite Jewish linguistic conventions were also used in some parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That is a pretty big thing. So it means that there might be something there, that Yemenite Hebrew might very well be as close to the original as possible. But again, we can't know for sure exactly. It is still being studied today. Its tone and inflection are very different from the normal Hebrew. And although I still understand Hebrew and I can speak Hebrew and I can hear it, when I hear Yemenite Hebrew, it is a little difficult for me to understand. And here's an example of Yemenite Hebrew written in a script called Rashi. I can read some of this. I see here it's Moshe Kibel Torah Mesinai, but I'm pronouncing it in the modern Hebrew way. The way I'm pronouncing it is not even close to how the Yemenites pronounce it, because you see all these vowels and different types of symbols up top tell you how to pronounce it. I personally do not know how to pronounce it. And it's really not pertinent to our purposes, but I just thought you should know. Hebrew script. There are a few different types of Hebrew scripts. In terms of biblical scripts, we have 3 major types of biblical scripts. There are others, of course, but I'm only going to deal with 3 that are probably the most prominent. We have the script that the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, are written in, and as you can see this example, very interesting. I can still read it. Vayitze Yosef el haaretz Mitzrayim. And this is about Joseph going to Egypt to stand before Lifnei Pharaoh Melech Mitzrayim. He is standing before the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And this is the original writing, I guess you could say. And then we have the standard biblical script that sort of bleeds a little bit into modern Hebrew. And here we have this. We have Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And the difference in these two scripts is that this has, clearly it looks different, but we also have vowels here. We have these little markings underneath the letters that indicate how these words are to be pronounced. And if you're a native of Israel, you don't actually need these vowels because you sort of already know it's part of your everyday life. So that's what this is. This is sort of standard biblical script. We have another script called Rashi. And Rashi is simply an acronym for the name of a rabbi, and that rabbi's name is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who lived in the Middle Ages from 1040 to 1105. He was known for two things. His examinations and explanations of the Hebrew text were probably the clearest you can get and the most concise, whereas other commentators tended to either water it down or they got a little bit too heady. He was very, very specific, and that gained him a lot of respect. But there's also a script that is named after him. And it's sort of a misnomer because Rashi never used Rashi's script, which is very interesting, but it's named after him anyway. So really, Rashi is a typeface and was used mostly as a way to distinguish between a religious text like the Torah or the Talmud and the commentary of those texts, because it was often hard to tell because you would have Hebrew font under Hebrew font, whereas Rashi gave a little bit of character to the word, so then you knew if it's written in Rashi, it's clearly an interpretation of the Hebrew text that's being presented. And here you will see Rashi, and if you don't know Hebrew, this looks, pretty strange, but it is Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet. I mean, it's the same Hebrew lettering, it's just in this sort of semi-cursive state. Now that we have the preliminaries out of the way, here are some of the more juicier tidbits we will be covering in the course. As I mentioned before, translating languages is not an entirely seamless process. Languages have various different structures that may not easily port over to English, and vice versa. I mean, clearly there are things in English that cannot be ported over into Hebrew, at least not accurately, or other languages for that matter. Not only does this lead to mistranslations, but often outright deception. Another thing that is missed is nuance that can only be gleaned from the original text. Remember, Hebrew letters themselves can impart certain information that is utterly lost in translation. Let's take a look at a few mistranslations, outright deceptive translations, and nuance that has not carried over in the translations. This will illustrate why even a cursory knowledge of Hebrew will help you as an occultist. We're going to use something that's sort of rather standard, and you probably know this, but don't worry, it gets better. The name of God in the book of Genesis is Elohim. Many of us know that there's something fishy about this word. In Hebrew, it is actually a plural word. It means gods, literally. This is clearly a mistranslation. In Hebrew, in most cases, when a plural is being used, there is an im, I-M, I guess you could say, added to the end of the word. For example, eggs in Hebrew is beitzim, shoes, na'alaim, men, gvarim, women, nashim. So there's that im, Elohim, you see, and that's a plural. There are, of course, plural words that end differently, such, for example, the word cigarettes in Hebrew is not sigarim, it's sigariot. And there's no N there, I-M, rather, or mem sofit, as they call it, yud mem sofit. But that's okay, most of them do end in I-M, and Elohim surely does. So in the Elohim example, we have a simple mistranslation, one of thousands, I can assure you. Now let's look at an outright deception. I will present several verses from the Old Testament both in Hebrew and in English. This is the story of the killing of Goliath by David. Here we have the standard story. First, let us introduce the name Goliath into the story so you can see his name in Hebrew. We have here the English, 1 Samuel 17, verse 23. As he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name. Okay, so now we have established that he is from the city of Gath, and his name is Goliath. In Hebrew, you see the bottom here, and I've highlighted it. Goliath, Philishti, Shmo Megat. So Goliath, the Philistine, his name, that is his name, from Gath. Okay? Pay close attention to this. Now we're going to present you proof that David killed him. And I only supply the English for this one because it's actually pretty straightforward, and both the Hebrew and English are the same here. So we have 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 49. And David put his hand in his bag, took thence a stone, and slung it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead. And, of course, he dies. Now here is where it gets interesting. We have established that David killed Goliath. The English and Hebrew translations agree. Perfect. Now, let's open up to 2 Samuel, verse 21, verse 19. First, I will give the English translation. In another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan, son of Yair, the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath, the Gittite. Okay. Nothing too odd about that, right? Goliath may have had a brother. Makes sense. Both Goliath and his brother were from Gath. In term of Gittite that we saw here, it actually just means a native of a Philistine town of Gath, which we had established earlier. And as you can see here, Gittite in the Bible, a native of the Philistine city of Gath. Now let's look at the Hebrew of this same verse. We read it again, right to left, but here is where it gets a little different. It says here that Elhanan killed et, or who, or the, Gliot Hageti. It says here, literally, he killed Goliath the Gittite. It doesn't say brother of Goliath here in Hebrew. It doesn't say brother. If you read the Hebrew, all it says is killed Goliath the Gittite. There is no brother in this verse. It says Goliath himself. So why is there brother in the English? Well, could be an overt mistranslation to cover up an inconsistency, maybe. In all fairness, some English translations do get it right, but even if the translation takes out brother, it still leaves a big problem. Who killed Goliath? Elhanan or David? It's a good question. Rabbis explain it away that say that Elhanan was simply another name for David. Well, the thing is that there's no evidence for that, so at least not in the Bible, so I don't know about that. But do you see the value of knowing something like this? Do you know how many of these types of things exist in the Bible in Hebrew, but because the English translation is wrong, you don't know? If a person didn't read Hebrew and had one of many mistranslated Bibles, they would have no idea that this existed. Okay, so I showed you 2 mistranslations, and both are pretty egregious. I might let the whole Elohim one go, but this last one is pretty tough to ignore. Inconsistencies seep into the English when attempting to translate Hebrew. Now let me show you a nuance in biblical Hebrew that is lost in English. I mean, completely and utterly lost. Several times within the Bible, mainly the Old Testament, God calls upon people by their name, twice. For example, Moses, Moses, Abraham, Abraham, etc., etc. Let's take a look at a few of these in English. Exodus 3:4. We have here, Moses, Moses, and Moses said, here I am. So this is God calling Moses. Genesis 22, verse 11. We have, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Genesis 46, verse 2, Jacob, Jacob, and he said, Here I am. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 10, Samuel, Samuel. Do you see the pattern? Good. You get the point. In English, this seems rather straightforward, but upon further inspection, the Hebrew looks a little bit different. It is very subtle, but I will highlight the point of difference. What you will see is a mystical teaching that tells you something about these prophets, especially one of them. Let's take a look at the Hebrew for these verses. Here we have Exodus 3:4. Right here, it says, Moshe, Moshe, or Moses, Moses. Genesis 22, verse 11. Abraham, Abraham, or Avraham, Avraham. Then we have Genesis 46:2. We have Yaakov, Yaakov, or Jacob, Jacob. Samuel 3:10. Shmuel, Shmuel. Samuel, Samuel. Do you notice anything different in this text? Do you see anything? Here, let's take a look. We have Moshe, Moshe. We have Abraham, Abraham. Jacob, Jacob. And Shmuel, Shmuel. Notice something with Abraham, Jacob, and Shmuel. You have this little dash here between the two pronunciations of the name. You have it here in Samuel. You have it here in Jacob. You have it here in Abraham. But you don't have it here with Moses. And the mystical teaching says that when God spoke to all of these individuals, there was a chain of prophecy. But with every one of these, except for Moses, there was no break in the conversation. In other words, once Moses accepted his path, God spoke to him continuously. Thus, no dash. But here we have Abraham, Joseph, and Samuel. Their prophetic tradition breaks off at some time, where God suddenly stops speaking to them. And that's what this dash means. Some people say, oh, it's a grammatical one, but actually it is not. In mystical teaching, it means that there was a break in initial prophetic transmission, and then it continued. Whereas Moses never had a break in his prophetic tradition after he accepted his plight or his mission, and therefore there is no dash. You see, could you have gleaned that in the English? Absolutely not. It's completely lost. And that's why it's very important to learn Hebrew. The above was just an illustration as to how translations can often take away from the original text. Although the above illustrates a loss of nuance in the translation, it actually isn't as pertinent to this course. But I will discuss more of these types of scenarios in my Kabbalah course. The main objective of this Hebrew for Occultists course is to read and understand some of the words we often see in occult seals, prayers, and other texts. So, although this is very interesting, this whole unending prophecy channel, it really won't teach you how to read Hebrew, but it's just something to look into, and I will discuss it again in the course. But if you really, really want to learn more about that, I will have that in the Kabbalah course that I'm creating as well. There are other issues with translations, and here's just a quick example. In the occult texts, we often find the names of various demons, and they are usually translated from the Hebrew, maybe Greek, and maybe some Latin. Here are a few examples from the Hebrew. We have demons such as Astaroth, Behemoth, Leviathan. Pretty common names in the occult. But what if I told you those are all mispronunciations of the original names in Hebrew? I also want to mention why some names of God that we see in these in the circles and other ceremonial magic traditions, like Agla, A-G-L-A. We often in the occult think, well, this is a name of God, but actually in Hebrew, Agla is an acronym for a biblical verse. But this is not I'm not going to get into that right now, but I will in the Hebrew course, because I think it's important for us to know what we're saying, what we're, when you're calling all these names, you have to know what you're saying. Most people think Agla is the name of God. No, it's not. It's actually a verse. But like I said, this podcast is not going to explain that right now. But you will learn it in my course. And I don't have an exact date when it will be completed, but I'm actually going to give it all my attention right now. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I will keep you posted as to when the course will be released. I hope you will find it very useful. I'm pretty sure you're going to get something out of it. Speak to you soon. So mote it be.